My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and I'm very pleased to have Hank Cicalo with me today. And I'm going to start out with a statement and see if you agree with it, Hank. And that is, for 60 some years, you've had one of the coolest jobs possible.
Very true.
What was it that sent you into this career? Was there some kind of moment?
Oh, no, not at all. Uh, I had served 4 years in the Marine Corps. I got out of the Marine Corps and I started uh, taking an electronic course an engineering course at Columbia University. I got a job at as a pickup job. I come in, pick up some slack in some small studio, and that led me into that. Before long, I had quit working in school and got a job in a studio, and that was the end of that. Worked in New York and a studio in New York. Uh, I didn't like the cold weather after spending a couple of years in Korea. I wanted to move to California, and with no job observations at all. Anyway, I came to California and worked in some small studios, and I finally got a job at A&M, and
Was
which
it rather
was
like an apprenticeship? Then you learned your craft by sitting next to somebody else.
oh yeah, no, there's no at that time. There's now schools and stuff for engineering, but at that time there was no school for engineering. I just happened to be get a lucky job working in a small studio in New York, and that led me into some bigger jobs. And then I decided to come to California. I didn't have a job, but I just had to get out of New York. It was getting too cold. After being in Korea for a couple of years, I wanted to get to the sun. Uh, so I left and I worked at Armed Forces Radio when I came out. It was the only job I could get in California. No, as a studio engineer, uh, I worked at Capitol and I worked at RCA Victor. And before I really became an independent engineer, but that was a great training ground because I got to work with so many different artists, and uh, it was a great training ground. And I worked with people like Don Costa for the first time, and that it was great. Um, I went to work for Old Records and worked with Lou Adler a lot. And I worked for A&M Records, but Lou had an affiliation and then that started Old Records and whatever. And I worked with Lou, which was a great experience, great and great producer. His style was so much different from the producers I'd been working, at Capitol and RCA. You worked with producers who came in with a score and they made it really strict, and the artists had to stay with it. And then I started working with those independent guys, and like Lou, Lou Adler, and it was a whole different kind of thing. It wasn't like a really straight bang up thing. You worked with Lou, everything was loose, and you were working for the artists. Everything had to be comfortable for the artist, and so I got into that whole thing with him too. I mean, we worked with the control room lights down, and I always tried to make it so that the artists were in a room and you were in another room. I would always try to work with the lights down in the control room, and it gave it a better feeling because people would look, the artists were always looking at the control. If they couldn't see you that well, it only made it the act better because they were concentrating on what they were doing instead of trying to impress the producer, you know? So if I kept the lights down and the lights in the studio up, and I tried to make it as comfortable as possible, I would set up dates where if it was a rhythm section and an artist was singing, I would try to wrap the band around the artist. Uh, Even if the artist was in a booth, I always tried to set it up so that everybody could see each other. And then it was much more of a feeling. A lot of engineers would put the drums in a drum booth, the guitar in this booth, and then the other guy. I never felt that really worked. Putting the artist maybe in a vocal booth was okay because you might want to do the vocals over again, or the artist felt it was more comfortable. And sometimes we just did it and it worked fine. With some artists, they wanted to come back in again and do the vocals. So you had to work with that situation, make them comfortable. It was always the object of the whole thing. I saw dates that guys would set up and they'd put the artist right in the middle of the room and he's facing the control room and everybody's looking at the artist and they're going to get a little bit uncomfortable. I always tried to make it really comfortable for an artist. And the thing that a lot of guys didn't think about. To me, I would set up a vocal booth and I'd have make sure there was water there. I'd make sure that there were clean cups. I'd make sure that the chair or stool that the artist was sitting on was comfortable. I tried to make it as comfortable as possible out in the room. I remember, or I saw guys would take an artist, and even if they were overdubbing, they put them in a booth and put microphone in there, and then like they felt they were locked in. Some people just worked fine. Other people felt really constricted by working that way.
Could you tell when a producer had also been or was an engineer? And might you butt heads with them if you're making microphone choices, for instance, and the producer goes, "Oh no, I don't think you want that one on the bass drum or whatever." Did you ever butt heads with people about those kinds of things?
I never really had that much trouble with producers wanting to do something differently. But usually, if it was something like the producer would say, this particular artist doesn't like to look in a booth. Okay, fine. So you set them up facing the
Yeah.
studio. You got to make the artist as comfortable as possible, and that was because it made it easier for you. I remember dates when guys would talk, artists would talk about. I hated to go to that guy. He always put me in a dark room, and I couldn't sing, and I couldn't see the music. I mean, you got to make the artist as comfortable as possible. Whether you're working with an artist live in a booth and you got a 60-piece orchestra out there, you got to remember that the artist is the artist. They're the ones that are performing. You got to make sure that they're comfortable, that their earphones are right, that the balance that they're hearing is a record balance. You know, there are guys who say, well, the artist needs to hear the piano and just the piano. And that's not right. If the artist can hear the orchestra surrounding them, and if they're wearing a pair of earphones in a booth, I mean, you got to close your eyes and think like you're someplace else. I've always asked the artist, how do you feel about that?
Hmm.
Well, and then you get an answer. Well, I don't like to look in the booth when there's people in. I
Okay.
don't like to see the lights on. I always work with my lights down low. Once I got the balance I needed, and that was it. people would look and say, gee, I, are you guys in the booth? Yeah. My thing was to get it as comfortable out there as, for example, with Carole King. And Carole liked to work because she was a musician. She liked to work with the band. So I had to always set up those dates with a piano in the middle of the room where Carole be there and surround her with the band, be it a couple of guitars, the drummer. I just set them all so they were, the only way I could describe it is that they were sitting in Carole's living room.
Ask you
Pardon
about
me?
Tapestry, and did you have a feeling with that record in particular that this was going to be a hit? Can you do in times
I
like
tell you, having done a lot of albums all those years, you get a feeling once in a while about an album being, this is going to be good. Generally, you keep saying this is good, but you never quite make it. Tapestry was right from the go, we felt it. And my method of setting up an orchestra or a band, rather not an orchestra, it's a different situation, but a rhythm section, a couple of guitars, piano, and the drums, let's say, and bass. I tried to make them surround them so that they could all see each other. I hated that thing where you put, if the drums are in a booth and you want them in a booth, that's fine. Then build the rest of the band around the booth so they all can see each other. These dates that they're stiff when you put the drummer in a booth and then you put the two guitar players on the other side of the room somewhere,
mhm.
and the bass player is looking, he's somewhere else and he's no contact with the drummer. Those dates are stiff. They don't work for me. My feeling has always been that they all have eye contact with a rhythm section, where they all have an eye contact, player, bass player, and the artist. I would put the artist in the middle of the room with the whole band sitting around him. It made them feel more comfortable because they had more contact. You put everybody in the booth, drummers are in this booth, and the singers are in that booth, and the guys are in here. It never felt right to me, because those poor guys are all sitting in a room playing. There's no eye contact. They don't see each other. I always made sure that the earphones work because I don't want in the middle of a date to have a guitar player say, I can't hear myself. That would always stop the date cold. So you always try to work it out so that everybody was looking at each other. Everybody was comfortable. If you had a guitar situation where the guitars are too loud, you can go out and talk to those guys. You could put up a couple of flats around them. And if you talk to them in the right way, and you're not bending down the fact that artistically, you don't want to deal with that,
Mhm.
but you, as an engineer, want to have the ability to be able to control all of the parts that are out there. That's what you want to do. If they're facing each other, fine. If they're in the booth, that's fine. As long as they're comfortable, they have to be comfortable. And hearing what they're hearing in those earphones are really important. And you always get to the situation. Years ago, I used to get bass. I want more bass. I want more guitar. I want more this. I more, more, more. I used to put up signs more, more, more.
How about when it comes to mixing? Uh, who did you like to have in the booth when it came time for mixing, or who didn't you want to have in the
I
booth?
I never had too much trouble with that. I mean, you get a producer if you have a producer. If the artists are producing, artist is producing, as soon as you give them that first playback where they're comfortable and their ears are comfortable, it makes it easier for you. That first playback, when you do a tune and they're working out there for an hour and a half to get them, finally you make 3 or 4 takes and they come in and listen to, they got to be right on. You got to be right on it. You got to figure out before they even set up sometimes, who's the lead artist, who's the lead guitar, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Get a good drum sound, earphones are important. Get the right earphone mix. Like I would do days and say, don't put on the phones yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I would get as much as I could out of the date. And then I would go to the earphones and work really carefully on the earphones. And then ask the guys, are you comfortable? The earphones are right. If the earphones are right and they're hearing a nice mix in their phones, man, your job is a lot easier.
Were you subject to the clock? In other words, if a record company had a certain budget for this artist, were you feeling like, well, we've spent 4 hours today and we've got one tune down. This thing has to speed up. Or was that not was that more on the producer to make that happen?
That's not my job.
Hmm.
That's if you're working with a producer, it's his job. I mean, if you run over because he's screwing around with a tune that he doesn't really like anyway, you got a problem. I mean, you could take a 3-hour date and work on one tune. If you're working on an album, you could spend a day on one tune. Or if the producer feels like this might be the single, or whatever, you want more control over it, you want to deal with it more. It just depends on the act and the producers. Some producers, the older producers, the guys that were really old time, guys that worked at Capitol, RCA. I mean, you had by old producers, I mean guys who were musicians to begin with. They were studied guys. They worked for RCA or Columbia or whatever. They were a company oriented. They had so much to do in a date, and they would try to make 3 tunes a day. They got 3 tunes a day. It depends on the artist. I mean, you can't stifle. I've seen it happen, boy, and that's the worst thing in the world. When you get a producer to say, "All right, come on, let's go," hurry up, hurry up. I never felt you ever got to perform. I worked with Lou Adler, who's really produced so many great records. And if things in the studio were not happening quite well, and they're close, he would let them develop that. He wouldn't be on the button right away. Let's do a take now. Lou would make sure that was everything out there was comfortable, and he made me make sure. How the phones, Hank, and the phone. Make sure the phones are all right.
I think
Good
it's
producers will do that.
I've had engineers tell me that on occasion they would assign a fader that did nothing, and
Uh,
if a producer or ad person was in there and said, "Can you give me a
nah,
little more?" No, you didn't have to do that.
nah. That's bullshit.
Okay,
You do that, you're killing the artist. You're killing everybody.
yeah.
That's baloney. You gotta make it work. You can't hide anybody. Now I'm gonna do this at the Vogue, and then they won't hear it. They're gonna hear it, of course. You know,
Did it make a
if
difference?
the relationship in the bigger studios, Capitol, RCA, whatever. By the time you got an artist down there in the booth, I mean in the studio, they're pretty well know what's going on. They've heard the band, they've been there, done their work vocals. Sometimes you get an artist who wants to do finished vocal. They're good enough to do it with a band out in the room, whether it be a real small rhythm section or a big band. The older artists working with a big band, Peggy Lee, whatever, John, but they're used to working with a band. And you get some of these artists that are not used to, they're working with a small trio. Now you start to dress them up
Mm.
with a hot rhythm section and studio players that are playing, you know, uh, straight. You can't have amateur hour now.
Yeah. Did it make a difference? The uh, I worked in a studio for a while, and the engineer had, of course, speakers in the walls, but in the booth. But then he had a couple Oratone, like just small
Yeah,
cube speakers, and
yeah.
yeah, he would check the mix on those things. I guess because he was thinking about car radios or that kind of thing.
Car radios was always the answer. I worked with producers. Give me a mix. You put it on a cassette. I'm going to play it in my car. That's nuts. I mean, is this car now the opinion? The, this is this is what it's going to sound like. No, you're going to make it sound for what it's for the best speakers you can. That'll always work. If you're going to try to work for a small speaker and somebody's, my car is different than your car, you can't do that. You got to make a good mix. And it's always a radio mix. What you're trying to do is to sell the record.
Who did you like to see, especially coming on a date, as far as the rhythm section players? Did you have favorite drummers and
Oh, oh yes. You have favorite drummers, you have favorite bass players, you have, and strangely, and not strangely enough, I mean, the guys that work together, um, for example, like in New York, New York players, I loved the way New York players played, but with Steve Gadd playing with Richard T, and it had always had a different. Those New York guys had a different feel because they worked together so often, and they knew how each. In LA it was different because you'd have a like in New York. What I'm talking about was like that. There was an A band. The A band was Richard T. Uh, 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 I'm trying. I don't get confusing. I would try, but they had a rhythm section that was their rhythm section,
mhm.
and it worked for almost everybody. They wanted the best guys, and they always got this. You
like
know,
those guys in
yeah,
Snuff?
it was always Ralph McDonald on percussion, and the same guitar players,
Bucky
Rich,
Pizzarelli. And,
you know.
yeah. But in
And
LA that was different then.
well, the New York, since in New York, there was a clique of guys, maybe 10 guys they worked all the time, be it two bass players or two drummers or whatever. Uh, in other words, they were like the on-call guys. They worked all the time. And then there were a lot of other guys that worked. Like at that point, it was up to the producer or arranger wanting a special drummer or something. But there was always an A band, I'll put it that way.
Mhm.
The A bands in New York for a long time was Richard T, Steve Gadd on drums, uh, Ralph McDonald percussion. I mean, he says you McCracken on guitar, Eric Gale on guitar. Those were the A guys. And same thing here in LA.
Mhm. Well, a little trade secret, for some reason I was thinking, did you have a special technique to record acoustic basses, which is always seems to be one of the harder things to do in the recording world?
Yes, they are. And I'll tell you what, one of the reasons is the fact the basses sounded so different. Guys would say, well, I don't know what's wrong. I can't, but that bass, go out there and listen to the bass. Put your ear up there, and you could tell if the bass sounds a problem. Sometimes it's the guy. playing a beautiful bass, but he doesn't play it well, you know? Some guy come walking in there with a cheap bass, and he sounds like he's magnificent. So it's usually not only the player, but it's also the instrument that you're dealing with.
Did you
I mean,
did you have
you
a
can
microphone? Did you have a
yeah,
microphone in front of it and then
listen, you can microphone a bass. I'm playing an acoustic bass out in the room. An acoustic bass, I'm not a real bass, not an amplified, but you can mic him three different ways. You can put a small drop, a small like behind the bridge, and put a small microphone there, and you get really a good hand signal. You can really feel the hand on the strings. Sometimes you just putting a microphone out there is fine. Sometimes putting a microphone in the F hole is better than putting it overhead. You know what I mean? It depends on the bass player and the instrument. I've had great bass players are good. I've had a good experience. Bass players, he'd be a great bass player, but he has a bad instrument. But he loves it. You got a problem, you know? Why doesn't it sound it it doesn't sound like it sounded last week when he did another date because he was in another studio. That engineer was futzing with his bass, and you know.
I see. What are the most memorable artists that I know it's like hundreds and hundreds of people that you've recorded. What stands out for you as one of the most enjoyable experiences?
The enjoyable experience is when the artists really come in knowing what they want to do. Like I've worked with Peggy Lee, or always on time, always ready, always she had the tune down. You know, everything, no problems. You just did it. And there's those artists that they never went to the meetings with the artist and the producer. I mean, the artist and the engineer, or the artist and the band. If the artist doesn't go with those meetings, he's losing something. You want the artist to be there with the producer, or if the artist is the producer, to work with the arranger. You don't want them doing that stuff on the date. It kills you. Now, there are some producers who like to work that way. Like they want the creativity to be instant, you know, like it happened in the booth, it happened in the studio, you know. Some come in very prepared with the arranger or whatever, and work very well. Some come in with nothing, and they work it out in the studio. It depends on the artist. I've worked on both ways.
Okay.
I've worked on whether an artist comes in and they want it to be a single, and they're really working on it, and a guy comes in and he works. You've never seen a tune, he's working on it for 5 or 6 hours. That's painful.
The first time I ever saw in the studio tape slicing and splicing, I was amazed that it worked.
Me
And
too.
I just didn't know such a thing was done the first time I saw it. So, um, do you recall the first time you ever did that? And were you nervous about it?
You bet. Uh, but it didn't happen very often. When my father was a second engineer working behind, let's say, John Krause at Capitol. I mean, he would, in those days, on a date, I'm talking about 20 years ago, the engineer could turn around and say, would you take the first half of the tune up through the first chorus and cut it to the next take of the same chord, you know, and that happens on a date. when there's 20 guys in a room talking, that's when you can get in trouble. I mean, as a second engineer, if you, I as an engineer would get into a situation like that sometimes because the producers would like, I'd like to hear it. The first chorus, I love that tune. The bridge, I love that. But could you give me the second chorus and take 12? Then, you got to juggle and whistle around. And hopefully you can make all the cuts.
Am I correct that you would manipulate the tape over the head so that you would hear?
Yes. No, I'll tell you what, you want a pressure? You're working on at Capitol. I'm working on a Peggy Lee date or something. And as a second engineer, you're running the machines. And then the producer says, but can we keep the first chorus on that take and go to this take 12 or whatever and put that second chorus together. And usually it's the second engineer who's running the machines that does the editing, if he's good. And I mean, if you're working at this Capitol or Columbia, they expect those second engineers to be able to do that. And inevitably, let's say you're working on a Sinatra day, which I did many times, and they'd say, take the first chorus from this take and I put that together. And they come in the control room, they're all talking, and you're trying to make an edit. And I would say, shut the F up. I can't hear what I'm doing. Oh, okay. Take it outside. I can't hear what I'm doing. I mean, you make an edit, and if you make a dumb edit and you screw it up, you look like a fool. Don't look like a fool. Tell them to get the hell out of the room so you can hear what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's even done with classical recordings, isn't it?
Classical recordings are generally, if you make edits in a classical recording, I mean, those cuts are made by a producer and the artist. I mean, it's usually an orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done those big classical orchestras. When you get an artist or of the caliber, and they want to be there when you're editing and stuff like that. And sometimes you're better off editing yourself with a producer. Sometimes if you're editing with the producer and an artist, the artist can get really crazy about, I want this take and I want those 4 bars and it gets into one of those things. We used to call them suicide missions because you knew that certain artists were always into editing. We'll get it. Let's take edit 1 and 2 and we'll put them together.
Yeah, once they see that stuff is possible, then they start thinking, "Oh, okay, now I know what I can do."
Exactly. See, we would have a better take on take 3. I like to take that second chorus. It's really good. Okay. And then they start talking to somebody, and the second engineer is trying to make edits, until we have, what these Eddie Tall blocks are now, on every machine there's a block where you can edit and, you can put it in this thing and you find out where you're, and you make a nice even cut. Years ago, we used to use scissors. And you got chorus 1 and chorus 2. You want, let's get chorus 2 from track whatever. So you have to put them together. In those days, before they had Eddie Tall blocks, now every machine's got a block on it. They're called Eddie Tall blocks, so you can have straight lines. In the old days, the engineers had a scissor. I can't describe them. It would fly underneath your hand, You could flip it out, and there would be the blades, and you'd make the cut, flip the scissor back in again, and put it, and make the cut and put it together.
Did you cut at an angle?
Always at an angle,
And what is the reason for that?
so that it's run smoothly across the heads.
I
You know
see.
what I mean?
Yeah.
First of all, you shouldn't have ever have a problem if you make a cut and put it together. And if you're a good engineer and a good editor, you're going to make it once, and it's not going to be. If you're not good and you miss the downbeat, and some second guy doesn't know what he's doing, and he lost the tape because he put the, if you're the engineer that's running the date, you got to make sure that while everybody's talking with one ear on what the second guy is doing to make that cut. And if you're not sure of him being able to make the cut, I have done many times, because I know that the second engineer is a new guy. He's a little nervous about making a cut on a date. I would never say a word. I just go and make the cut myself.
Hmm.
I don't want to put that guy in any kind of pressure. And luckily, I worked with a lot of great engineers when I was coming up, and that's the way they operated, and that's the way they work. Until they got comfortable with you, or I got comfortable with the second and say, to make him make the edit, I was, but if I wasn't sure about a guy making an edit, I don't want him to take the wrong take, like you say, I'm keeping the first chorus from this take, and the second chorus from take 12. You better make sure that he knows where he's going and you're going. And the whole control room's talking at the same time.
Yeah.
And you got to keep them talking and pay that attention. And but the other ear is listening to where the second guy is going. I'll tell you the things that I got into a thing a couple of times with Tom Scott, but what we actually did was it was a transition from one tune to another tune, where you could just do it with two pots. But there were a couple of times where Tom wanted to keep the thing going a little longer. So you had the cut that you normally would make is not going to work. We would do these really surgical things. You take, instead of the editorial block, which is really 6 inches, you take 2 pieces of masking tape and put them down and put the tape between them, and you can make a long splice from left up to do, and you've got a 6-inch edit. You've made a transition. If you could do it with 2 pots, it's one thing, to another mix. But if you're trying to keep that mix together, I've done that many times. And you're cross-fading between 2 pieces. You better be right when you start cutting that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he told me that you would do mixes where you had 16 faders and he had 16, and I can almost picture how that. No, no, not yet. Don't push that up yet.
It happens occasionally, but if you're a good editor, nobody's ever going to bother you with that stuff.
Yes.
I
What
mean,
was
I was really good because I worked with a lot of great guys. My career was when I went to work at Capitol, although I had worked in the business for a while, you had to start from the very big. At Capitol, when you started in the cutting rooms, so where they physically cut albums and records. So you got to hear what all these engineers were doing, which was a good training ground. By the time they always started in the cutting rooms. And then if you were really good, they'd give you, okay, now you can work down in the studios as a second. And then from working as a second, you get to build up a relationship with producers, artists. And the next thing, a producer will say, gee, let me use Hank on this. And I think Hank will be a good engineer on this. And then that's how you get a start.
Hmm.
And then producer hangs on to you. And
Was there
guys,
technology changes
guys
that,
like that. Rather, the the guys that you didn't want to work with were those guys that the artist would say, I want to make a cut. Uh, the guy wanted to make a cut in a certain place, and you knew it was wrong,
hmm,
and you try to tell them that it's wrong, and they don't want to be embarrassed by the fact that they're talking to you, and they got you in the wrong place. You got to gently, I've done a couple of times where they give you to say, hey, cut it right there, and you can't cut it there because of the brass section is playing. You don't say anything. You just move the tape up, 2 bars and make the cut and let it go.
yeah.
Sometimes the producers, we used to call them, I can't use the
Used to
word,
call them,
flying F cuts.
okay.
Producers say, cut it there. Cut it where? Where's the downbeat? What do you want me to cut it? And if you cut it in the wrong place, you're not a mind reader.
What's your opinion? You're driving down the street these days, the music that you hear coming out of some cars is very different from what you would have heard coming out of cars in the 1960s.
You bet. I think that we worked a lot better in the 60s. I mean, equipment and stuff have gotten better since the 60s. But I don't think that, music doesn't change. Music is music. And whether you do a date with Duke Ellington in 1960 and you do a date with Duke Ellington and, now, the music is still there. You just got to make it better. That's all. I mean, I was a second engineer on a lot of Duke Ellington dates. And boy, they flew. You had to be really quick. You could turn around and say, give me that second chorus. Trying to find where the second chorus was. And they're all talking and drinking coffee.
What possessed you to try to get the members of the Monkees to play their own instruments?
I didn't have much to do with that. I
Okay.
mean, uh, so, let's see.
Chip Douglas?
Well, Chip came in later. I'd already done 2 albums,
Uh-huh.
but that was all right. When Chip came in, they all wanted to do their own stuff
Hmm.
and their own place, so it was a little strange. A lot of them were not players before they began. For example, in the drums, um, Mickey didn't. He never played drums before, but they were going to make him the drummer, and so Columbia sends the drummers over to his house, and where the guys drop the drums is where he learned to play. So the snare was on the wrong side. The toms are on the wrong side. But that's the way they set it up. And for 3 or 4 weeks, every day, every night, he played those drums. When he came to the studio, I set up the drums the way I normally would. And he looked at them and he said, no, I don't know what to do with this. Because for weeks now, he's been playing all by himself in his house, bashing away. And the snare wasn't in the right place for him in the studio. It was on the wrong side. Should have been on the right side. It's on the left side, that kind of thing. And I had to adjust that. Does that make sense?
It does. It's like
I
learning
mean,
a guitar left-handed or backwards or something.
right, exactly. Exactly. And I mean, it's a lot of those things they didn't play very well.
Hmm. Well, you've seen it all, that's for sure.
Boy, and more. I've seen, I thought I saw it all, and then something would come and somebody would come in with something I never even heard of before.
If you,
Some, I remember everybody got into this Japanese thing, and suddenly I had a date when they were bringing a koto, the Japanese string instrument.
a koto, yes.
It's a big guitar kind of thing. The strings are on top, and I, I just looked at it and how am I going to mic this thing? And I put mics on top, two microphones on top. It just didn't sound right. I couldn't get it to where I wanted. I said, let's put a microphone because it sits on a stand. Put a microphone underneath and let's see what it sounds like. I put a microphone underneath and all the strings sounded separately, like they were supposed to be. I had a mic on top. It didn't sound right. It sounded cluttered. I mean, you just have to experiment sometimes because, that kind of a guitar is sitting up on a stand. You could put a microphone underneath it.
I see.
And that's what I did. And it cleaned up the sound. So, sometimes you can't take what the artist is telling you. Here, mic it here. So you mic it there, and God, it sounds off.
Okay.
You know,
Okay, last question. If you put in a 10-hour day in the studio, when you got out, did you want to hear silence?
I mean, when I went home,
When you got home, did you just like, oh, my ears, I got to hear nothing?
no, I would clear myself out by if I'm doing like a rock and roll day. And I used to live in Woodland Hills. That was a long way from the studio. I would listen to jazz and something. I never, it never blocked out one thing or the other.
Okay.
If I'm doing jazz, I was doing jazz. If I was doing rock and roll.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. This was very informative, and congratulations on your career.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Good. You ever get like phantom checks in the mail from anything you recorded? Like,
Random checks in the mail. I wish. Oh, I've got a couple of good reviews, but
okay.
I've always wished for the checks in the mail.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm in the spoken. If I produce something, all right, I'm expecting
Yeah.
checks in the mail, but it depends. It depends on the producers you're working with.
Yeah.
If you work with a guy like Lou Adler, you're getting there's a lot more to it than just money. You're working with a good
Yeah.
producer, and he's producing good records, and that's means a lot.
All right. Well, I'll see if I can send a random check your way.
Okay, it'll go somewhere, I'm
All
sure.
right. Thanks a lot, Hank.
If I can do any more for you, please call.
All right.
Thank you.